Okay, get this. You've got this big historical tour, right?
Yeah.
All smiles, supposed goodwill mission. But what if, like underneath all that, there was this hidden story? A story of raw imperial ambition, secret deals, and, well, pretty devastating consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So today, we're kind of pulling back the curtain on that. We're doing a deep dive into the 1905 Imperial cruise. Now, this was led by William Howard Taft, the Secretary of War, and President Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice, the celebrity daughter.
Right. Princess Alice.
Exactly. And it's often presented as just this straightforward diplomatic charm offensive. But the source we're digging into, James Bradley's book, The Imperial Cruise,
Yeah.
well, it paints a very different picture. Much more complex and, frankly, quite shocking.
Absolutely. And that's really our mission here today, isn't it? To peel back those layers. We want to uncover the hidden motivations behind America's push into the Pacific around the turn of the 20th century. We're really going to explore Theodore Roosevelt's worldview, which was powerful, definitely, but also, pretty unsettling in some ways. And his secret diplomacy, the stuff that wasn't in the newspapers.
And the consequences, right? The long-term fallout.
Exactly. The long-lasting, sometimes truly devastating consequences that, well, you just don't often read about in standard history books.
So let's start with the surface. This Imperial Cruise, it was quite the show, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A spectacle.
You had Taft, Secretary of War, pretty large man, 325 pounds, they say.
Yeah.
And then Princess Alice, President Roosevelt's daughter.
Total media sensation.
And paparazzi loved her.
Totally. And add to that 7 senators, 23 congressmen, their families, staff, all crammed onto a train across the country, then onto this huge passenger ship, the Manchuria.
It sounds like quite the trip. Expensive, too, I bet.
Oh, yeah. Over $14,000 just for the train part. Then another $28,000 for the ship. We're talking nearly 3 months. And Alice, she knew how to play the game. There was this famous spontaneous dive into the ship's pool. Yes, I read about that. Not so spontaneous, was it?
Not at all. It's completely staged for the photographers, to grab headlines. It was all designed to look like this fun, glamorous diplomatic junket. Dazzle and distract, basically.
Right. But beneath that, beneath the sort of jovial party atmosphere, that's where you find the really disturbing part. This deeply ingrained ideology.
The Aryan myth.
The Aryan myth, exactly. Or sometimes called the civilization follows the sun idea. And this wasn't some fringe theory. This was mainstream thinking among America's intellectual and political leaders, including Theodore Roosevelt himself.
Okay, so what was the core idea?
Well, the basic belief was that the white race, the Aryans, were the founders and the only ones capable of maintaining civilization. Any sort of dilution of that whiteness as they saw it would inevitably lead to decline.
Wow.
And they saw this not just as an opinion, but as a fundamental law of nature. It was just accepted.
Where did this even come from? How did it get so embedded in American thinking?
Well, it's got a long history. You can trace it back to the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about these supposedly pure Teuton people. Then King Henry VIII in England sort of hardened the myth in the 1500s, using it to justify the Church of England as a return to pure Anglo-Saxon roots.
Okay.
Then it crosses the Atlantic. You have figures like Bishop Berkeley talking about empire traveling westward. Thomas Jefferson, a founding father, he embraced this idea of Saxon ancestry to justify independence. He even wanted Hengst and Horsa, legendary Saxon chiefs, on the Great Seal of the U.S.
No way. Seriously.
Seriously. And then crucially, you have the Naturalization Act of 1790. This law literally limited citizenship to free white persons. So this idea of racial exclusivity, it was baked into the legal system right from the early days, woven into the fabric of the nation.
Okay, so if this Aryan myth was that pervasive, that foundational, how did it specifically mold Theodore Roosevelt? The man, his personality, his political drive.
That's a great question. Roosevelt came from an aristocratic background, and his father was actually worried about something called over-civilization, this idea that, races could become too soft, too refined, and decline.
So Teddy had to toughen up.
Pretty much. He got into rigorous bodybuilding, cultivated what they called barbarian virtues, basically, fighting spirit, aggression, things they thought were essential for racial advancement. He read tons of dime novels, the pulp fiction of the day.
Yeah. Full of stereotypes, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Crude racial stereotypes, heroic white frontiersmen, villainous Indians, dim-witted black characters. He really absorbed this stuff. He admired Teutonic virility, and his education reinforced it. His Harvard professor, Nathaniel Shaler, taught white supremacy outright.
No. At Harvard.
at Harvard. And then at Columbia, Professor John Burgess taught that only people with Teutonic blood were fit to run the state. Roosevelt called Burgess a formative influence.
So it all feeds into this image he created.
Exactly. He meticulously crafted his public personas, the ranchman, the Rough Rider. His books, like The Winning of the West, weren't just history, they were arguments. They glorified the English-speaking peoples, which was his code for the white inheritors of this Aryan tradition.
Conquering the waste spaces.
Right, which just meant lands inhabited by non-white people. He was incredibly conscious of his image, too. Wouldn't let photographers take pictures of him playing tennis because he thought it looked weak, undermined his masculine image.
That's quite a look into his mindset. And it really throws a wrench into the usual story about America expanding into the Pacific, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That whole narrative of benevolent intentions.
It absolutely shatters it. You see, the U.S. had finished expanding across the continent, right? Manifest destiny was kind of done, geographically speaking, on land, so the next step was naval power.
Mahan's influence.
Exactly. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, was huge. Roosevelt loved it. Mahan basically argued that to be a world power, you needed a strong navy, and you needed to control key ports around the globe, like links in a chain, he said, for trade and power projection.
And the Spanish-American War provided the opportunity.
It was the perfect excuse. The USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor in 1898. There was no real evidence Spain did it, but that didn't matter to Roosevelt or the Yellow Press, like Hearst's newspapers. They whipped up war fever.
Did Roosevelt actually want war?
Apparently, he privately admitted, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. So, yes, he saw it as necessary for national vitality, tied into those barbarian virtues we talked about.
Which brings us to the Philippines.
Right. And this is where the story gets really ugly, particularly the betrayal aspect. There was a Filipino freedom fighter, Emilio Aguinaldo. He was fighting against Spanish rule and actually sought help from the U.S. He thought they were allies fighting for the same cause, independence.
But that's not what happened.
Not even close. He was completely sidelined. The Americans made a deal with the Spanish. The so-called Battle of Manila was basically a sham fight, staged so the Spanish could surrender to the Americans, not the Filipinos. U.S. troops actively blocked Aguinaldo's forces from entering their own capital city.
So the U.S. just stepped in and took over from Spain.
Precisely. They refused to let Filipinos participate in the surrender ceremony. They just lowered the Spanish flag and raised the American one. Aguinaldo and his movement were just ignored, pushed aside.
That's just, yeah.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop there, did it? What happened after the U.S. took control? How did they justify, well, what came next? Especially with this idea of benevolent intentions floating around.
Well, what came next was essentially a brutal race war. The U.S. Army waged a counterinsurgency campaign against the Filipino independence movement that lasted for years, and the tactics, they were horrific.
Like the water cure, I've heard about that.
Yes, the water cure. A form of torture, forcing water down someone's throat, was used widely. There were also direct orders that were just genocidal. General J. Smith famously ordered his men to kill everyone over 10 on the island of Samar, kill all Filipino men over the age of 10.
Unbelievable. How do they talk about the Filipinos themselves?
They were constantly demeaned in racial terms, called Pacific Negroes, Apaches, Sioux, basically linking them to other groups the U.S. had fought and subjugated. General Arthur MacArthur, who was the military governor there for a time.
Adelgus MacArthur's father.
Oh, that's the one. He actually testified before the Senate that these brutal actions were just part of the historical mission of the Aryan races expanding across the Pacific. He framed it as inevitable progress.
And McKinley, the president at the time, kept talking about benevolent intentions.
Exactly. That framing was crucial. It allowed the American public back home to believe that what their army was doing, however harsh it might sound, was ultimately for the Filipinos' own good. Compassionate, even. Soldiers might write home about the brutality, but the official line was benevolence.
So how did Roosevelt solidify this narrative? Because he becomes president after McKinley.
Right. Roosevelt was a master of public relations. Look at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Huge event. He used it brilliantly. He set aside the largest part of the fairgrounds for a massive Philippines reservation.
A reservation, like for Native Americans.
Precisely. It was deliberately placed right next to the Native American exhibit. They brought over 1,200 Filipinos and displayed them in, essentially, human zoos.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, they presented them as creatures closer to monkeys than human beings. You had exhibits ranging from, like, Igorot people in loincloths, labeled dog-eaters living in fenced-in villages, all the way to displays of civilized Filipinos kids in American-style schools, uniformed members of the Philippine Constabulary.
What was the point of showing that range?
The message was clear. Look how backward these people are, but see how we, through our benevolent assimilation, are uplifting them. It was propaganda, pure and simple, designed to show the process of civilizing the savage.
And did people buy it?
Massively. It was the most popular exhibit at the fair. An estimated 18.5 million people saw it. It profoundly shaped how Americans viewed Filipinos and justified the colonial project. And while all this was happening, or just after, Taft and Alice are sailing towards Hawaii, putting on that charm offensive.
Wow. The disconnect is just staggering. So let's follow the cruise. Next stop, Hawaii. Another place often seen as, peacefully becoming part of the U.S. But I sense that's not the real story either.
Not at all. The story of Hawaii is just as fraught, though perhaps less overtly violent in the initial takeover compared to the Philippines War. But the impact was devastating. It starts really with Captain Cook's arrival in 1778. Yes, the so-called Great White Plague. Tuberculosis, venereal diseases. They absolutely ravaged the native Hawaiian population, which had no immunity. Their numbers plummeted. Then came the American missionaries.
And to save their souls.
Ostensibly. But they also condemned traditional Hawaiian culture. The hula, surfing, religious practices, calling it all indecent, pagan.
Yeah.
They imposed their own strict values.
But there were economic motives too, right? Sugar?
Big time. Many of those missionaries, or their descendants, like Reverend Amos Cook, became incredibly wealthy sugar planters. They pushed for land reforms that essentially privatized commonly held land, which meant those with money, the foreigners, could buy up huge tracts.
And the native Hawaiians?
They were largely dispossessed. And when these new sugar barons needed labor, they didn't primarily use Hawaiians, who they deemed poor candidates for hard labor. Instead, they imported contract laborers, mostly from China and Japan, changing the island's demographics forever.
And strategically. Why was Hawaii so important to the U.S.?
Location, location, location. It was seen as the crossroad of the Pacific, absolutely vital as a coaling station for the expanding U.S. Navy. This was locked down with the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875, which was pretty much forced on Hawaii and gave the U.S. exclusive rights to use Pearl Harbor as a naval base.
So it wasn't just annexation later, it was a gradual takeover leading to the overthrow.
Exactly. The overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. It wasn't a popular uprising. It was orchestrated by American business interests, mainly the sugar planters, with the direct involvement of the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John Stevens. He ordered U.S. Marines ashore.
Even though there wasn't violence or chaos.
Right. Honolulu was peaceful, but the Marines surrounded the royal palace, essentially intimidating the Queen into abdicating to avoid bloodshed. Sanford Dole, yes, of the Pineapple family, became president of a provisional government run by the white oligarchy.
And Roosevelt's take on this?
He was furious that President Cleveland initially delayed annexation. Roosevelt called the delay a crime against white civilization. He was worried about Hawaii falling into non-white hands, specifically fearing an influx of low-caste laborers from the yellow races. Annexation finally happened in 1898 during the Spanish-American War fever.
So, back to the cruise in 1905. Alice Roosevelt is famously photographed learning to surf at Waikiki.
Right. A lighthearted moment, perfectly captured for the press. Taft was apparently worried about her showing too much ankle, the indelicacy for the photographers.
But the context.
The context is incredibly dark. For the white sugar barons hosting Taft and Alice, the annexation was a triumph, a cause for celebration. But for native Hawaiians, the Kanaka Maoli, called halos by the colonizers, it was a tragedy. Their kingdoms stolen, their culture suppressed.
Were they included in the official welcoming?
Tellingly, no native Hawaiians were invited to Taft's big celebratory luncheon in Honolulu. Their absence speaks volumes, doesn't it? A chilling symbol of who this goodwill tour was really for.
Okay, so the cruise moves on. Next major stop, Japan. And you used this striking term earlier, honorary Aryans. That really jumps out. Tell us about Japan's role in Roosevelt's grand strategy.
Yeah, honorary Aryans. It's a jarring term, but it reflects how some Americans, including Roosevelt, came to see Japan. See, Japan's experience was unique. After Commodore Perry forced them open in 1853, the Japanese leadership made a very calculated decision.
To avoid being colonized themselves.
Precisely. They realized they needed to rapidly modernize and militarize to deal with the West on its own terms. This was the Meiji Restoration. Their policy was sometimes called Leave Asia, meaning stop thinking like Asians, start thinking like Westerners.
How did they do that?
Everything from adopting Western technology and military structures, their slogan became rich country, strong military, to social changes. They essentially reinvented Emperor Meiji as a divine figure, adopted Western clothing for officials, studied Western political systems. It was a massive national effort.
And the U.S. reaction?
It was fascination and a degree of respect weirdly framed in racial terms. Because Japan was succeeding, becoming powerful in a Western mold, they weren't seen like other Asian nations. They became the Yankees of the Far East, the honorary Aryans. A non-white nation, yes, but one that could potentially be an ally or at least a useful player.
Useful for what?
For Roosevelt's geopolitical chessboard, Japan started its own expansion, Okinawa, Taiwan, and then they set their sights firmly on Korea.
And Korea thought the U.S. would protect them.
They really did. They had an 1882 treaty with the U.S. that included a good offices clause. They interpreted this to mean America was like an elder brother who would step in and help if they were threatened. They put a lot of faith in that promise.
But Roosevelt had other ideas.
Completely different ideas. Secretly, Roosevelt wanted Japan to take Korea. He saw it as a necessary check against Russian expansion in Manchuria and the Pacific. He viewed Japan, the honorary Aryans, as fighting America's battle against, in his private words, the degraded Chinks and the slovenly Slavs. It was racial geopolitics.
So this gets into the secret diplomacy during the Russo-Japanese War, right? And this concept of a Japanese Monroe Doctrine for Asia. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating that war.
Which is the ultimate irony, because behind the scenes, he was actively enabling Japanese imperialism. A key figure here was Baron Kentaro Kaneko, a Japanese diplomat, Harvard-educated, very smooth.
He knew how to talk to Roosevelt.
Oh, yeah. Spoke his language, intellectually and literally. They had 19 months of secret talks. 19 months. And in these talks, Roosevelt essentially gave Japan the green light. He orally endorsed Japan establishing a protectorate over Korea and having a dominant sphere of influence in Northeast Asia, basically, a Japanese Monroe Doctrine for their region.
And this was formalized during the Imperial cruise.
Yes, that's where the Taft-Katsura Agreement comes in. While Taft was in Tokyo, he met with Prime Minister Katsura and formalized this secret understanding. The U.S. wouldn't interfere with Japan and Korea, and Japan wouldn't interfere with the U.S. and the Philippines, a quid pro quo.
All while Roosevelt is publicly the great peacemaker.
Exactly. The deception was immense. The world wouldn't find out about the full extent of these secret agreements until after Roosevelt died. Meanwhile, the Korean emperor, Gojam, was sending desperate appeals to the U.S. for help, citing their treaty. Ignored. Yeah. Completely ignored. Soon after the cruise, the U.S. closed its diplomatic legation in Seoul and turned its affairs over to the Japanese. Korea's independence was effectively over, snuffed out with American complicity.
It's also worth noting, didn't Japan have its own colonial exhibit at that same St. Louis fair?
They did indeed. Mimicking their Western mentors, they put their own colonized indigenous people, the Ainu from Hokkaido, on display. It just shows how quickly they adopted the practices of Western imperialism, seeing it as the path to acceptance and power.
The layers of hypocrisy are just astounding.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift to the final piece of this puzzle on the cruise, China. Historically incredibly advanced, but by this point being carved up. How did China fit into this picture, especially with the U.S. pushing its open door policy?
Right, China. For centuries, it was arguably the most populous, wealthiest, most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. Movable type, suspension bridges, porcelain centuries before the West. But by 1900, it was weakened, internally fractured, and being preyed upon by Western powers and Japan. Portrayed as uncivilized, the sick man of Asia.
And the U.S. policy was the open door.
Yes, which sounds nice, right? Like free trade for everyone. But the hypocrisy was just glaring. The U.S. demanded an open door for its goods and influence in China, while slamming its own door shut at home with Chinese exclusion acts.
Preventing Chinese immigration.
Exactly. Starting in 1882, renewed and strengthened over time, these laws explicitly barred Chinese laborers, and later almost all Chinese, from immigrating and becoming citizens purely based on race. Roosevelt himself was fully behind this, calling the Chinese a potential race foe and arguing for race selfishness.
So demand access there, deny access here.
Pretty much. Open door there, closed door here. But China wasn't entirely passive. They found a powerful way to push back.
The boycott.
The 1905 boycott of American goods. It was a widespread, unified, and remarkably peaceful protest against the discriminatory exclusion acts and American arrogance. And it worked, initially. It significantly hit U.S. exports. Companies like Standard Oil reported huge losses.
And Taft's visit during the cruise was supposed to fix this.
That was the plan. He made a secret side trip to Canton, Guangzhou, to try and smooth things over, pressure the local viceroy to stop the agitation.
How'd that go?
It was a total failure. The viceroy essentially snubbed him, claiming he was sick. Taft met with some merchants, but it achieved nothing. The boycott actually intensified afterward. Roosevelt and Taft had completely underestimated Chinese nationalism and their ability to organize collectively. They just saw them as individual merchants, not as patriots.
There's also a darker side to the American connection with China, isn't there? Going back further.
Oh, absolutely. The opium trade. It's often overlooked, but a significant portion of the wealth of prominent New England families, including Franklin D. Roosevelt's ancestors, the Delanos, was built on trafficking opium into China in the 19th century, a trade that devastated Chinese society but was incredibly profitable for Western merchants.
So the benevolent relationship was complicated from the start.
Deeply complicated and often deeply exploitative.
This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive. It just completely reframes the narrative around America's rise as a world power and Theodore Roosevelt's role in it.
Yeah.
That Imperial cruise, it wasn't just a trip, it was a symbol, wasn't it? A symbol of these hidden currents.
It really was. You have Roosevelt, the master publicist, crafting this image of the rugged peacemaker. Remember the photos on the USS Mayflower hosting the Russian and Japanese delegates for the peace talks?
Right, the Nobel Peace Prize image.
Exactly. But behind that carefully managed image were these secret deals, these racially charged calculations, like his endorsement of Japan's ambitions in Korea. And that endorsement, that secret agreement, it had real consequences. It arguably helped pave the way for Japan's later, much larger expansionism.
Which ultimately led towards
World War II in the Pacific. You can draw a direct line from the policies and attitudes embodied in that 1905 cruise to the conflicts decades later. It's a connection that often gets lost.
understanding these hidden histories, these nuances. It's just so important, isn't it? It helps you, the listener, really see the forces at play, maybe even understand current events a little better.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a final thought, something for you to maybe chew on. If nations, kind of like people, create these public personas, these carefully managed images, how much of what we accept as history is actually just really good PR? And maybe more importantly, what hidden currents, what unspoken deals or assumptions might still be flowing beneath the surface of international relations today?